Good morning. I've got a little background noise here from two eager people outside, right outside my window with blowers, and they just passed by my window and now they're working away from it. So maybe I can hear my own self think. Good morning. Our lesson for today is the very famous and well-known, I hope, parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. It comes in two parts. The first part has to do with lawyers, actually it's the Pharisee, and their questioning of Jesus. They want to make sure this guy is, that they being the Pharisees want to make sure this guy is legit, that he knows the law. And so they question him. And they ask him what's the core of the law, and he answers and so forth. Well, it turns out love your neighbor as yourself is the second big part of the law. And it's the lawyers then try to trap Jesus. And does he really understand the law, what neighbor means? And he, in typical fashion, goes on and tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. So I would like to look at the first part of the lesson, that encounter with the Pharisees. It actually is recorded in all the synoptics, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there's differences. I'm thinking that Luke and Matthew and Mark are all reading from the same incident. And it's interesting they have different takes on what happened during that incident. And that's fascinating to me that two people looking at the same document, depending on what their position is in life, et cetera, will find something different in it. Well, let's look at the piece from Matthew first, and then we'll get to the piece from Luke, which is the source of today's lesson. This is Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You should love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now, Matthew just goes on, and now the Pharisees were gathered together, and Jesus asked them a question, saying, so forth and so on. There's no querying about what do you mean by neighbor. So let's look at our lesson as recorded. That first part is recorded in Luke, and this is in our lesson book. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, Jesus said to him, and you've given the right answer. Do this and you will live. So he asked about inheriting the eternal life. That is to say, the kingdom of God. But now Luke goes on further. He goes beyond what Matthew did. Matthew was done with it, but now Luke goes on. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? a good lawyer wants to know what the boundaries are. When does neighborhood end and stranger begins? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell in the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. I looked on the internet to find something about what the road from Jerusalem to Jericho looks like, and I'm glad I did. It is amazing. The altitude drop from Jerusalem down to Jericho is tremendous. The road is a path, really. It's windy. It's exactly the place that an ambush would be a smart thing to do if you're desperate for money. And that's what everybody hearing this back in those times knew about the road. But I had to find out. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to that place and saw him, he passed on the other side. All right, well, everybody knew about those priests and Levites. They were sticklers for the law and were the upstanding citizens in this discussion. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I'll repay you whatever you have spent. Jesus has just finished the query of the lawyer. The lawyer was asking, okay, where does neighborliness stop and strangerliness begin? And I think it's pretty clear to all hearers, Jesus is telling there is no boundary. But we'll go on. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor? Very clever way of getting at the definition of neighbor in contrast to what the lawyer was expecting. Which of these 3 do you think, Mr. Lawyer, that's me, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the lawyer said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. He's telling the legal eagle, there is no boundary on this neighborliness. And I think of neighborliness or neighborly, neighbors, somehow think of that as a verb. I will call the interpretation that most of us have for very familiar passages the ho-hum interpretation. You got to work on it and have some guidance to see beneath just the surface. It's ho-hum because we read the Bible and automatically, at least I do, take the position of the good guy. Yeah, that's the right thing to do. Ho-hum, so what? When that Jesus is trying to get around that. I would guess that one of the predominant ways that a person reading this would be Pharisaic in the sense that we've got a do list of things that it says we should be doing, and one is to be neighborly. And so we just check these things off according to the law. What should I be doing? In the military, that's a little easier to do. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. And once you've done your job, everybody's happy. But Jesus is radicalizing that. He says he's going to write it on our hearts. and you're never done. You are never done. You cannot do enough. And thank goodness for the grace of God. Well, that's painful when you see that. When you know you got this discipleship, that you want to be a good disciple, but you know you really, in the end, you cannot measure up, and you got to live with that. Keep hacking away, persistence. About a month ago, September the 13th, we had a guest preacher at DCPC over YouTube. It was remote, and I hope those of you watching this also saw Brian Blunt, who's president of the seminary in Richmond, Union Presbyterian Seminary or something like that. There's a big office in Charlotte as well. He gave a lesson on a different kind of parable, but the same thing. Jesus is saying, look, you just don't have boundaries where forgiveness in this instance, but where you have to forgive up to this point, and then beyond that, somebody's really done a dastardly deed on you. No way you can forgive that. The strict adherence to the law, the sort of the Pharisaic trap, I'll call it. The ho-hum interpretation of his passage would be, well, little synopsis. This is a landowner with some servants. He leaves, and one of the servants really messes up the business. He essentially loses the business, a huge amount of money, something he could never pay back. And the landowner comes back and forgives the person for the dastardly deed he did to get into the position of losing the land. But on top of that, he forgives the debt. He doesn't have to pay anything back. Well, what does this worker do? He turns right around, finds a fellow worker in the same camp who's done him a dirty deed in some way. He owes the worker, first worker, maybe a denarius, something, a day's wage. At least it's possible for him to pay it back, but he can't. And so the first worker says, off to debtor's prison for you. And okay, so that's a synopsis of the sermon that Brian Blunt gave about a month ago. Well, he began the sermon without saying what the passage that he was going to preach on is. Now, if I'd been a good scout, I could have read, it was called the extravagant forgiveness or something like that. But I just knew it was Brian Blunt preaching, and I wanted to hear him. So when he began the sermon, he was whining. He's saying, oh no, I've got to go to DCPC as a guest preacher, and I'm looking at the lectionary, and the Bible verse for all Presbyterians in that Sunday is one I hate. I don't like it. And I looked and looked for another verse to substitute for it, but I just couldn't find it. I thought, Dr. Blunt, what in the world are you doing? Well, it finally dawned on me what he was doing. Even after the sermon was over, I didn't realize how brilliant a sermon it was. What he was doing, he performed it even physically, other than whining and complaining about. He didn't like that parable. There was no podium, no lectern. He wasn't preaching from anywhere. He just stood there with us. That's the feeling we were supposed to have, and I got it. With us, a sinner, a person who saw what Jesus was doing. He wasn't saying, okay, you can, how often should you forgive somebody? And, twice or so. No, forgive them, Jesus would say 7 times, 70 times. That is to say, there is no boundary. There is no boundary. You've got to forgive, even though heinous things have been done to us. And Brian went ahead and said, in case others like me are slow to pick up on the aura that he had set up by complaining and being very informal. He said, "Dadgummit, Jesus," a couple of times, for putting me in the position of knowing I'm not measuring up. Of knowing I'm not measuring up. You put me in that position. Jesus has radicalized the law. It's nothing like you got 2 or 3 things a day you got to check off and then you're good to go. No, he made that, the feeling of that was just very powerful. And I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon any better than that. He just got down there with us sinners. And of course, we were ho-humming along, not realizing the burden that's really ahead of us. And he made it so that we felt it because he feels it. Okay, well, I hope you saw that. In fact, just to make sure that I wasn't misrepresenting his intentions, I watched it a second time, and I'm sure, well, I say I'm sure, I don't know, but I assume it's still in the archives if you want to go back and check me out. Well, something happened to me along the lines of ho-hum early this week, in the early part of this week. I was out on a walk, and my agenda includes exercise, boy, and I want to get that done. That's something I'm going to check off for the day since I'm sequestered at the house. So I was out walking. My purpose was to walk. It didn't make any difference where I was going, but I was walking along, and it kind of left the neighborhood. And here comes a couple that I know. And I hadn't seen them, and I hadn't seen anybody in a long time. And we greeted each other. She is now the caregiver. Her husband is incapacitated. Age has a big factor of it. He was in a wheelchair. And so we had pleasantries and glad to see each other, and just went on our way. And it was a couple of days after that, and here I am preparing for this lesson on being neighborly, and it finally hit me. I said, oh no, here's an opportunity that is the kind of getting under the ho-hum business to understand that there's no boundary for what a neighbor is. I mean, it doesn't have to be next door. Jesus is saying there's just never a boundary between neighbors and strangers. Here we're clearly neighbors under any definition. And the thought never crossed my mind, well, I should just go speak to her and say, please let me relieve some of this burden of wheeling your husband around. It didn't occur to me. Okay. That was a couple of days ago. Now, have I done anything about it? I've had time to think about it. Telephone's been there the whole time. I've done nothing. Woe is me. Well, here's my rationalization. I am trying. I decided she was wearing a mask. I was wearing a mask. We were out exercising. She's very aware of the coronavirus. And here I would be putting a burden on her by calling her up and saying, let me come and be close to your husband. And she's protecting him, of course. If he should get the thing, then I'm afraid it'd be curtains. So there, I'm a rationalizer. I'm guilty. Well, that's pretty heavy stuff. I'm going to close with one other personal experience that has to do with interpretation. The theme here is we read the Bible, what we bring to the Bible verse is pretty much going to determine what we hear or when we read it. That's been the theme, and we've had Brian Blunt come down here and really sock it to us that we better think hard about falling into the trap of the Pharisee, saying, okay, we've got so many do-good things we can do this week, and we can check those off, and we're in good shape. He's upset the apple cart, and but at least we still have that. We're not going to get over bringing our own thoughts to situations, in particular reading the Bible. Well, this is kind of like that, but it has a light touch to it, and I want to end with a light touch. One of the most fun things in teaching at Davidson is Alumni Weekend. Each of the faculties find a spot, or it's advertised that we will be gathered together for 2 hours on reunion afternoon, and former students of ours can go find us, and we have some reunions with our former students. And mostly majors come, math majors will come, and but one time this student came, he was in one of my classes, wasn't a major, but he came with a purpose. He said, I have a high school junior who's very bright, and I'm trying to see if he can influence him a little bit to come to Davidson. Oh, I thought that's great. He says, the problem is that he's very interested in meteorology. And of course, I broke right in. I said, oh, that's great. I'm interested in climate change, and you have to learn something about weather science if you're doing that. And I think, oh, I bet he would be happy here. A good liberal arts education, blah, 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 blah. Well, he said, now let me tell you an incident about that, as whether he'd be happy here at Davidson. He says, 1 week every year, we go to the beach together, and this is a North Carolina beach, much like probably one of the ones we go to as well. He says, we were up early with my son and I, and just thought, well, shoot, it's a good, fresh looking morning. Why don't we just go have a dip in the ocean before breakfast? So off they go, and I'm imagining this part, that there's sand dunes between where their rental is and the beach. And my experience is you walk to the top of a sand dune, you have a nice vista of up and down the beach, and then you descend on the other side and go to the ocean. All right, so I'm assuming it was sort of like that, and that father and son were walking out towards the beach, got to the top of the sand dunes, and the dad says, I spied 2 very pretty bathing suit clad teenage girls walking in the direction that we would intersect as we descended and walked on towards the ocean. Just about Bobby's, I'm making the name up, his son's age. So he said, I said to Bobby, I said, Bobby, look. And I was looking towards the ocean. And Bobby turns around, he says, wow, Dad, red sun's in the morning, sailor's warning. Red sun at night, red sky, sun. Red sky in the morning, sailor's warning. Red sky in the night, sailor's delight. Says, you know, Dad, the red sky in the morning, the reason that's a warning is the dust particles have been blown out because the weather system is moving out, and the dust particles filter out the high frequency sunlight, and that leaves the red, and that's why. And the dad just started laughing. He says, what do you think? I said, oh, well, I think we better let that boy go on and follow his heart to meteorological school. I don't think he came to Davidson. I'm sure that guy is happy where he is. And that's a nice way for us to stop. And I appreciate you watching. Until next time, goodbye.